Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking about minigames. Minigames in RPGs. We're going to mostly be talking about D&D, but we're also going to be talking about some other role-playing games and how they do different sections of the rules, different minigames within the overarching rules themselves. I figured that in order for us to be on the same page, I'm going to go ahead and give a definition of minigames that I got off of Wikipedia. And the definition there states that a minigame is a short game often contained within another video game. A minigame contains different gameplay elements and is often smaller or more simplistic than the game in which it is contained. Some video games consist entirely of minigames, which tie in to an overall theme, such as the Olympic Decathlon from 1980. Minigames are also used to represent a specific experience, such as hacking or lockpicking or scanning the area or other things that tie into a larger game. And Jordan, I really don't like this definition. There are parts of it that are really good, but in talking with you gave a much better definition in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that definition that you just read is very much a video game kind of definition. The one that I came up with specifically for tabletop role-playing games is something like the following. It is an interactive, modular, specialized subsystem that offers the player or players some options. It costs them some resources, and it has to have some kind of randomized outcome that is influenced by the strategic decisions made by the player. So some of that might have been implied from the first definition, being that, you've got the video game running the randomization and all that sort of thing. But I think those 3 points, the player having options, the cost in some form of resources, and the semi-randomized outcome that the player has ways of influencing one way or the other. That's the thing, and that it is modular, I think, is like probably the thing that makes tabletop role-playing games the most unique form of gaming, because if you look at board games, like they're pretty much a set system right there. Card games are often the same way. Video games almost always are not open for any kind of modification, but the role-playing game just begs for you to drop in little games here and there, or take stuff out if it's too much of a pain in the ass. And you could argue, and I'm pretty sure this is where I come down on it, that a tabletop role-playing game is in fact not a single game, but it's a superstructure that knits together a whole collection of mini games. And what those mini games are is kind of up to the game master's tastes and to the player's tastes, but you can't really point at one thing and say this is Dungeons and Dragons or this is Call of Cthulhu or whatever your game is. When you really look at like what the players are doing at the table, there's a variety of different little games that they're playing depending on the phase of the game that they're in, the context, the time scale, all these different things. So that's the kind of stuff that I wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think my first experience with the modularity you were talking about of a mini game in an RPG was back in 3rd edition. This is not the first mini game that was that I saw in the RPGs, because like you just said, every role-playing game is basically a conglomeration of mini games. But very early in third edition, Monty Cook created a D20 conversion of Call of Cthulhu into the D&D rule set, basically. And rather than creating his own system for sanity, he just wholesale cut out the Chaosium sanity system and plopped it down into third edition D&D, percentile dice and all.
It was among the worst versions of Call of Cthulhu, by the way.
Agreed. But it was the first one that I ever bought.
Yeah, I also got suckered by that. But yeah, you're right. Like every time I look at a new role-playing game, I'm thinking, all right, what can I just take the scissors to and graft this into whatever I'm currently running? And I think that's one of the things that has been one of the reasons for such an explosion in the diversity of different role-playing games over the years. Like right from the jump, as soon as the Dungeons and Dragons shows up, you've got all kinds of clones that are just having all these different takes on it, and you can go back and look at them. It's something about the game itself that is like begging you to just hack at it, to tweak things that exist there, or just come up with your own completely different way of handling particular things. I mean, in original D&D, right down to specific monsters, fighting them wasn't exactly like fighting other monsters. It was almost like a mini game in itself. It's one of the few things I like that 5th edition has done. Some of the higher level monsters with like layer actions and things like that, and legendary actions have brought a little bit of that feel back. But yeah, it just begs for you to contribute something original to it.
Yeah, and even the original D&D, Men in Magic, just basically said, hey, for combat, use chainmail. So they were cutting and pasting a different system into the D&D system right from the jump.
Yeah, and their entire game or their entire system for overland travel was the outdoor survival game from a completely different company. Like that's wild. Like take this board game from Avalon Hill and use it for when you're traveling from dungeon to dungeon. That's nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already discussed where two of the major areas of mini games kind of reside in D&D, in combat and also in exploration. Jordan, you have a pretty extensive list of breaking down all of the different mini games that you saw in most role-playing games, but it applies specifically to D&D. We've talked about that combat itself is a mini game in D&D, and then within that mini game there are further mini games like grappling is its own mini game. In third edition, disarming was its own little mini game. This is something that has been with the game forever, and I don't think you could make a role-playing game that wasn't this conglomeration of several different games, several different smaller games, much smaller games, just kind of put together to create a greater whole.
Yeah, the only differences between games at this scale, I think, are the level of granularity that the system wants to go into. Some fancy themselves as rules light, which just means offloading the way of determining outcomes to the game master on the fly, and some are, very rigorous in figuring out every little point and every little formula. See Pathfinder, etc. But yeah, one example from old D&D is you used to be able to subdue dragons, and that was a combat mini game. I think you could do it to other monsters too, but it specifically comes up for dragons, and it's like something like grappling, and it's something like combat, where you basically just sort of pin the dragon down and get them to a point where you could kill them if you wanted to, and then force it to surrender and agree to just follow you around and become your pet, slave, I don't know what to call it. But then there's a little bit of stuff in there about like, you know, as soon as it gets a chance, it'll try to fly away or eat you or whatever. Doesn't really explain like how any of that is supposed to work exactly, but there's definitely some dice rolls to make to subdue a dragon and, I don't know, ride it or something. Like, it's really fun.
And see, it's wild to me that something like that has just dropped out of the game rules, especially considering how much of a meme it is that the ranger/druid in the party is accumulating a menagerie as the adventures go on.
Yeah, and if the, you know, OSR is about anything, I think a lot of it is about resuscitating some of these mini games that have fallen by the wayside over the years. You know, people talk a lot about procedural play and that sort of thing, and that is part of it. It's a big part of it.
We were talking before the podcast, and you have a distinction you want to make about what is and is not a mini game.
Right. So, like we were saying at the beginning, you know, a mini game has to have some element of choice on the player's part. I think it's worth drawing a line between that and just the procedures of play that is largely administered by the game master, dungeon master, whatever. These are game mechanics that are running in the background. These procedures that involve, you know, depleting your resources, your water, your rations. Also, some restorative things. If you get rest, you get hit points back. You get, you know, spells or whatever it is. These sorts of things have some of the elements of a mini game in that they are subsystems of the overall game system that have their own things that factor in and so on. And sometimes player choice can affect these in some ways. I don't know if there's a bright line between the two. Things like, you know, healing. Do we stop and try to rest in a dungeon and get what rest we can, or do we try to get out and get a better rest somewhere else, or go back to an inn and get the best rest possible? You know, a lot of this depends on how much your game system cares about things like that. This is one of those places where the game system does matter and how it influences play. But, you know, it's a lot of these things are just things that are just happening to the player characters that the DM has to keep up with, as the attrition of the game is there to try to wear down the player characters and force them to act and recover and, you know, so on. So yeah, that's the distinction. Do the players have multiple ways of approaching a problem, or is it just something like the weather where it's just occurring to them?
And it also sounds like there's a lot of what you're talking about it that isn't really a mini game, is more a component of a different mini game that can sometimes be done on its own. Like you were talking about hit point restoration, like you drink a potion of healing. That could be part of the combat mini game. It could be part of the post-combat recovery mini game. But because it just seems to lack something about it that isn't in and of itself a video game, even though it kind of checks some of the boxes. It checks the box of a resource that is being used or expended. There is a little bit of randomization if you roll how many hit points your healing potion gives you back. There is kind of the decision whether or not to do it, but that decision is part of the greater mini game of recovery.
And I think those things, those sorts of things could be considered kind of a mini game for the dungeon master that the DM is playing while the game is going on. If you add in some kind of game mechanic that limits the dungeon master's ability to do things. Some systems do this, and some have some sort of economy between what the players are doing and what the DM is doing. You pass some sort of token back and forth or something like that. But like, you know, if it's spelled out ahead of time that the dungeon master only has, you know, let's say 5 random encounters that they can drop on the players in a given game session or something, then the DM is playing some sort of strategic decision-making role with, you know, okay, here's what's going on with the group's hit points and spell resources and so on. Do I, you know, send a random encounter at them now? Do I wait till later? You know, the Dungeon Master is a player too, though people don't seem to like the idea that the Dungeon Master is playing against the party necessarily these days, but yeah, it kind of has to. But yeah, it's again, it's just down to what the system accommodates for things like this. But like Savage Worlds has something very much like that with the Benny economy, right?
Yeah, and a lot of other game systems have some sort of resource that you are accumulating and can be used to influence things. D&D has, the 5th edition has the inspiration. Savage Worlds has bennies. Fate has fate points or fate chips. Yeah, and other game systems like Vampire or any of the World of Darkness, there's some sort of resource that you're managing. Like in Vampire, it's your blood. Either your blood pool or your blood die in 5th edition.
I tried to do a rough job of categorizing the kinds of mini games that we would play regularly. Mostly this is, you know, a fantasy kind of game that I had in mind when I was doing this. But roughly speaking, I see 3 categories that are sort of location based, and then 2 that are more like types of game mechanics that could occur in any of those 3 locations. The locations, you might guess, would be like sort of the civilization, the urban, you know, the place where humans or demi-humans or whatever hold sway. That's things like, you know, gambling, crafting, spell research. You know, some players want to run businesses, that sort of stuff. The other category I was thinking about was wilderness. That's your navigation. It's mountain climbing. It's foraging. Could be sailing. Things like that. And the last location one is dungeons, and that's your sort of procedural dungeon crawl. But even that familiar setting has a whole bunch of little mini games within it. You know, you've got searching for traps, you've got disarming those traps and picking locks. I would argue that managing your light, especially if you're playing one of those systems that kind of randomizes when your torches go out and things like that, that is a type of mini game there. So that sort of stuff. Also, you know, things like puzzles, mapping the dungeon, that sort of thing. So that's the 3 location ones categories of mini games that I had in mind: civilization, wilderness, and dungeon. The other 2 we've kind of talked about a little bit. Combat, I think, is very clearly its own mini game. It's almost a whiplash kind of experience for new players when you go from like just learning the stuff about like, okay, I'm this character and I'm talking to these NPCs and blah, blah, blah. And here comes some goblins for your first fight ever. And then suddenly the world changes. You zoom in, the Final Fantasy fight music starts, and like suddenly you're playing this other thing that's, you know, this little thing with tokens on a grid and so on. Very clearly a mini game. The other one we might not have gotten into much yet is Magic. Just the Magic system, period. The wizard especially is always kind of doing their own thing. They're worried about their own spell components, accumulating spells, making scrolls, brewing potions. If there's counterspell mechanics, if there's other sorts of meta magic things, like all these pieces here are types of mini games that specifically the spellcasters have to consider. If you got clerics, maybe it's some system of sacrifices or, you know, religious holidays or, you know, something like that. You can gamify all these things. But yeah, that's the broad categories that I had in mind: civilization, wilderness, dungeon, combat, and magic. What do you think of that schema, Clayton?
I think it's as good as any. I personally broke it down by the pillars of gameplay in D&D. That's identified in D&D 5th edition, and that's combat, exploration, and social interaction. And also kind of added in downtime activities as a separate category of mini games that exist within the game. But I mean, yours is just as good as mine.
So let's talk about what makes a good mini game. Like you've run a shitload of games, probably more than me. When you're sitting there behind the DM screen, or even before that, you're getting ready to throw a session together. You know where your players are going to be. You can't just have some kind of script in mind, because people are going to do whatever they want to do. All you can really do is populate this area that they're in with interesting things for them to do while they're there, and hence the mini games, the game of the game. So what are some of your go-tos in different situations? What do you like to run? What do you dread running? What would you like to run that you haven't before? What do you think?
I think the most operative word in all of the things you just said is interesting. There's nothing worse than a mini game that is not interesting in some way. We want excitement in our game, and we get that by throwing things out there that the players want to interact with, or things that they have to interact with, or else there is some sort of a consequence within the game itself. So that's what I go through whenever I'm trying to cobble together an adventure, and in parlance of this episode, create the mini games that go from the beginning of the adventure to the end of the adventure. Like you were saying earlier, that combat is its own thing. Whenever I design an adventure, I'm very much an encounter based. I very much design my adventures in an encounter based method, where I try to come up with something that is going on in a particular scene or encounter that is interesting, and that the player characters can interact with in some meaningful way. And that doesn't always happen, because the things that I think are most interesting or most important for the feel of the game that I'm trying to run is not always something that the players themselves are going to find enjoyable. But just because something isn't enjoyable doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be important and it's not going to be interesting. Like Jordan, the biggest example that comes to my mind is where we are in our first edition game. Finding out what the hell magic items do is probably the most interesting mini game that we have encountered so far. And that is entirely us basically taking some time aside and literally in character playing around with something, playing around with an item that has detected of magic until we figure it out. And sometimes it's taking quite a bit of time for us to figure it out. Sometimes we can figure it out just by random happenstance, but there have been a couple of items that it seems like we've had to set aside the time and resources in order to identify the item, and because we're playing a first edition game and the identify spell is not in the rules yet, this is making identification of magic items a very interesting thing in the game. Like I remember the frustration of us trying to figure out what these various items do, and then the elation and joy when we discover, oh, these are boots of flying or boots of levitating. How the hell do we turn them off? Because our character is levitating straight up and we have no way of getting him back down.
Yeah, I would highly recommend any DM that is about to run a new D&D game, it's probably in something that you can slide in after you've already started. But if you're going to start a new game, maybe don't tell your players what the magic items do when you hand it to them. You know, if it's just like a +1, +2 or something, obviously that's all there is. But if it's some special thing, let it detect as magical and then leave it at that. I've decided I'm never going to allow the identify spell in my game, period. No one in the world has that spell. I think it's bullshit and boring for the reasons that you're talking about. It keeps magical items something interesting, something scary, something, full of possibilities. Keeps it from being taken for granted. Yeah. Anytime a magic item pops up in front of you guys, everything kind of changes. The temperature in the room just gets a little different, and everyone's kind of like, what in the fuck's this thing? It's great.
Yeah, and it's also something that I get to look forward to, is we're in a dungeon. Do we want to risk trying to use this item that we know is magical, but we don't know what the hell it does? And my character personally has at least one item off the top of my head I can think of that I've had for more than a year now at this point, that I have not had the time to set aside to identify what the hell it does. And quite frankly, I'm kind of afraid to just slip it on and figure out what the hell it does, because it was picked up in an area that, I say I've had it for more than a year. No, I picked this. It's one of the rings that my character literally picked up at the conclusion of the first adventure that we did. So I've had this pretty much the entirety of the campaign, and I still don't know what it does. And that's one of the things that is interesting and I look forward to doing, but there's a lot of inherent danger in it as well for my character. And those are the main elements that I want to, whenever I'm designing an adventure, those are the things I want to, those are the critical elements that I want to have presented to the players for them to have fun doing this role-playing game that we're all playing. Because we're not here to sit around and just micromanage our inventory for no good reason. There are systems where micromanaging your inventory is very important. I'm thinking specifically of like any game set in the Dark Sun campaign setting. Micromanaging your equipment is very important, because you absolutely need to know how much water your character has, because you're living in a desert world where if you are without water and you're 3 days out from civilization, your character, it becomes a life or death thing for your character.
Yeah, and there's a lot there. The one thing I wanted to say is, as a DM, if you're about to play with a new player or a new group of players that you just don't know them or don't know them very well, it's a great personality test, kind of a subtle way of figuring out a few things about a person. When they sit down, they got their new character, and you give them a randomly colored, randomly scented potion from wherever. They don't know what it does. See what they do. There's at least 2 very different types of players there. It's kind of important for you to be able to suss out which type you're playing with. There's probably more than 2, but there's at least one major bifurcation there. Does the person say, fuck that, I'm not touching that at all? Or does the person slam it and say, hell with it, what happens?
Yeah, and specifically with potions, I've never been a big fan of the type of DM who gives a potion, and if the character is inexperienced, they can taste the potion in order to figure out what it does. I am the type of person who, whenever I am designing my game and there's potions in it, all of the potions of healing will probably taste the same. But that first one, you cannot identify it just by taste.
I waffled back and forth on this for a while. I went completely random on all of it. It's pretty much up to brewer's preference. and a few other things. What it shakes out as looking like, tasting like, smelling like. But anyway, what are some mini games that you hate? You're playing in my D&D game now, and I know you hate puzzles. So there's that. But like at any table, you sit down to play a game, and you find out this is the next thing that's going to come up. I guess nobody likes a mini game that they're kind of forced to play. But given that, what sorts of things are just a huge drag for you?
Yes, puzzles I hate. There's really not any other mini games that I hate, but there are ones that I'll be damned if I haven't seen a system be able to do them in a way that is fun and engaging. And a lot of that is, like, personally, dungeon exploration. The procedures of going through a dungeon and methodically exploring it. It is a very important game. It is how you get to the exciting bits, but so much of it is just not exciting. Like, Jordan, you've done a lot to improve the system and make it not as much of a slog, and it is something that we are still working on. But rules as written, doing a dungeon crawl makes me want to pull my remaining hair out.
Why? What is it that you hate about it?
It is the procedure of doing a whole lot for nothing. Like a group of people going through the dungeon and just, if it is just making perception rolls, making investigation checks, just making rolls that don't have a result. Like, for instance, a thief searching for traps. If the DM is making them make one search roll for every square, every game square, and saying, nope, no trap there. Nope, no trap there. You didn't find any trap there. That gets so old so quickly. Just going through something with no result. That is the thing that I just can't stand. We have made progress in making it not that much of a slog, where one thing, you're making the rolls in secret. That eliminates a huge part of it. That eliminates a huge part of the slog for me. But then there's also the procedure of keeping everybody together. The mini game of the player characters hurting themselves through the dungeon. Our group is, I don't think it's atypical in that we do this, but every time we have the individual option per player and player character to do something, we deviate from our plan of either attack or plan of progressing through the dungeon, because there is this mentality of players that if I am given the spotlight for something, I have to do something while I'm in the spotlight. You've probably noticed that over the past few sessions where we have been doing a dungeon crawl, basically, I've been pretty quiet whenever we're figuring out what all of our characters are doing. And it's all for that reason.
Yeah, one thing we're trying out now as we go through Palace of the Vampire Queen, which we will be reviewing upon completion, so stay tuned for that. One thing I've tried to do to minimize this herding cats down the hallway kind of way of gameplay is I'm really leaning on the caller as the leader of the group at this point, and we're using Roll20, and we've got the whole dungeon as a game grid map out. What I'm doing now is just using the caller's mini as representative of the group, completely ripping off things like Final Fantasy from the Nintendo days, and I don't know if Final Fantasy games are like that anymore. But that's the idea. Like, don't give every single player a choice every single turn of the dungeon crawl. It takes way too fucking long, and you're going to spend 4 hours going down a hallway. Elect a caller and let the group tag along. And if somebody really wants to do something different and deviate, that's fine. You can handle that. But, I think it's cool if you can get party buy-in to just kind of kick their feet up and let the caller drive when the entire group is supposed to be heading in a direction. And the first session I really tried doing that, we immediately hit some friction because they got ambushed by spiders from this one room that they walked in from the ceiling. And immediately it's, oh, well, I didn't say I entered the room. Oh, well, I don't remember saying blah, 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 blah. Everyone's trying to figure out some way of like, oh, I don't know about that. I was probably standing over there. No, you got to just fucking accept the consequences if you're going to let, one person drive and not worry about every damn square foot of space in this dungeon and get somewhere in a reasonable amount of time. You have to just kind of concede some of that you're going to fall into bad situations and then you'll work it out from there. So that's my rant on that.
And I would say that this most recent session we had was the best session of Dungeon Crawl we've had. You enforced us to have our marching order and our spacing. And whenever we came to something interesting, which was the spider room, you were using something that we had all previously agreed upon to adjudicate where everybody was at that time, at that point in time. And yeah, some people complained, but it got us through a section of the dungeon that on a typical night would have taken us fucking the entire session. In the past, we have covered as much territory in the course of an entire session as we did in the first portion of the session that got us to the spider room.
Yeah, I didn't count squares, but I guarantee if you just look over like number of squares traveled, you guys probably covered 5 or 10 times more ground last session than you had in the same dungeon the session prior, with a comparable number of combats as well. So anyway, that was all kind of an aside for the dungeon crawl stuff. Clayton, you're one of those players that really digs downtime. I've run a bunch of games for you, and probably more than any other player I have, you are just chomping at the bit to get some downtime every time, whether you're playing a wizard or some other kind of character. What kind of downtime mini games do you really like, and what ones are not so great? Here's another place where I think the mini game and procedure distinction is important, because there's some downtime stuff like, I'm just going to train and spend some money. If there's no role to it, if there's no like chance of failure, it's just here's where I'm, spending a resource to do a thing or whatever. I'm buying better gear, stuff like that. Doesn't really count as a mini game in my mind. But as far as like those gamified things that happen in a city when you got a couple of months and whatever, what sorts of things do you look forward to, and what sorts of things are you not such a big fan of? And if you have some examples of those, I'd like to hear them.
For the most part, the ones I do, but I don't really enjoy are the procedural ones where these are the things that my character has to do as part of their job as X role in the party in order to facilitate my character being the best that they can be at their job. I'm one of those players who really enjoy all of the extra stuff that my character gets to do when he's not at work. That's how I prefer to view downtime activities, as this is what my character gets to do when they're not working. And I always come up with this for my characters. So that's why I'm always champing at the bit to get this downtime, and it's not something that I always get. So the types of things that I I do, but I don't really care for are the very prescribed things of I'm using this time in order to make a sword. And this is just a mundane sword, or this is just a magic sword. I absolutely love the systems where you can do those types of things, and if you're making a magical version of it, there's a chance that it could have some other ability imbued upon it during the creation of it, for good or for ill. I'm a big fan of positive magic items that have drawbacks. And I'm also a fan of item creation systems that have some variability, even in mundane items. Like I loved in 3rd edition the chance that I could have made a masterwork item whenever I was just doing a normal crafting of a sword. Those are the types of things that if I have an idea of what I'm going to get out of it, but then there's a possibility that I could get more. Those are the types of things that I really enjoy doing. So gambling is another fun one where, yeah, I could go in and my character could go in and just lose all of their money, or they could come out a big winner and double, triple, quadruple the amount of money that I had put into it. The ones that have, just the ones that have more I can get out of it than what I put into it.
Yeah, the open-endedness of some of this stuff is what gives it some spice. Yeah, I agree. That reminded me in our D&D game, it was kind of hilarious to me behind the screen that one of our priests spent their downtime leading up to this just brewing a shitload of potions. And for my particular game, I run that a Cure Wounds potion and a Holy Water are the same exact thing. They do both purposes, and they're functionally identical. And we had a priest make like 30 of them because they know they're going to fight vampires, and everybody just assumed that they all were fine. Hadn't come up yet, but it will. That's not how it goes. But the thing that I was thinking about that I like in a mini game, I like the open-endedness stuff, but I also like the like in result. But I also like those things that are open-ended in that they will throw additional adventuring hooks somehow. Like I really love like thief shit in cities. If it's burglarizing some wealthy noble's mansion, or assassinating someone, or just spying on somebody, stuff like that. There's a lot of opportunity in some of these weird little things to just create new avenues for adventure that wouldn't show up necessarily, on the tavern's adventurers wanted board, or wouldn't even occur necessarily as a random encounter. But when players like stick themselves out there and get in the shit, this gets into like local politics and stuff too. Do you get a noble as a patron for your group? Do you fall in with some rebels and help like orchestrate a revolt or something? There's just so much shit you can do if you just start messing around a little bit with some good random tables or something like that, or maybe gradations of success or failure off of whatever your target number is. What you don't want is just like you were saying, just a flat like success or failure in these mini games, because then it's just like, God, this is just a stupid hoop that I jumped through. Big deal.
Yeah, and you brought up making a stronghold, or you didn't say those exact words, but that's kind of what you were hinting at. But yeah, that's something that all of my characters have, at least in some degree, is creating a stronghold of some sort that is then the the springboard for future adventure or future complications for the character. I have never played in a game of either Birthright or Pendragon or any of those other games that have basically kingdom management as a major component of it. And those are the types of games that are on my bucket list, that one of these days I am going to be a player in one of these games. I don't want to be a GM for those types of games, because I don't want to run a game that I absolutely want to experience as a player. I know that if I get those game systems, I am just going to it's going to make me a little bit depressed, knowing that, okay, I have everything that I need in order to play in these types of games, except for the DM willing to run me through it, and the other players willing to play it as well.
Yeah, well, hang in there for my first edition game, man, because that's where the game inevitably gets to once you get it at a certain level. That's one of those things that's been built into D&D from the beginning, is and arguably existed before the rest of the game did. The idea that you're raising an army, essentially, you're clearing out some plot of wilderness, you're earning land and title maybe, and you're spending all of your gold on building some kind of stronghold, and then I'll be damned, villages start popping up, and then you're taxing peasants, and things just get rolling, and it turns into this real-time strategy kind of game almost. That's what you do as a high-level character in Dungeons and Dragons. It's either that or go plane hopping, one or the other. But yeah, maybe one day. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just waiting to be able to construct my wizard's tower, where I can then create a dimensional gate to other dimensions.
Let's get into one thing here. We're getting long in the episode, but I want to get your take on another scale of mini games that we haven't touched on here yet. We've kind of been on both sides of it, but that's what I'm calling the wilderness category. I haven't heard you pipe up too much about this, and I honestly don't know where you stand on these sorts of things. I've run post-apocalyptic games with you in it that kind of gets into some of this navigation, foraging, that sort of shit. But how do you feel about that whole category of land navigation, climbing, swimming, organizing watches, all that stuff? Do you like that shit, or do you just wish we could just hand wave and get from point A to point B?
This is probably the one that most depends upon the system. I don't really like wilderness exploration in D&D because it really doesn't even feel like a mini game. It feels like just that procedural checking off of boxes. It never feels like it's a meaningful decision. I've yet to be in a D&D game where the choice of whether we take the road and cut through the forest has really had that huge of an impact on the game. That being said, there are game systems where I've had a lot of fun, where the exploration is literally the game. And I'm not just saying this because you designed it, but Apocalyptia does that very, very well. It makes scrounging for items interesting. Not knowing what types of, traveling through an area you don't know, not knowing what types of buildings are nearby, and the types of buildings that are nearby affecting what types of items you would be able to find in there. I just don't see that happening in most D&D games, where I go out into the wilderness and I make a survival check to see if I make enough, if I can find enough water and enough food to feed myself and 1d6 of my companions.
Yeah, it does more often than not come off as like a sort of opposed roles to the to that kind of attrition procedure that the DM is always running, more than it is like an interesting set of choices for the player to make.
Of all of them, I would say that sailing is the one that is most sorely lacking in substantive mini gaming, because you have navigation, you have weather, you have all of the things that go on aboard a ship that are required to get from point A to point B. And yet in D&D there's really not rules for it, and it doesn't ever feel like there's any sort of an effect that the players can have on how a sailing voyage goes.
That's one I struggled with a lot. And I still don't have any answer to it, because the problem with a sailing situation is that if you take it easy on the players, the only variable that's going to change is how soon you get to where you're going, and if you veer off course, if you wind up somewhere else. Those are really the only things that are at play. And random encounters are really hard to come up with when you're on the open sea. More often than not, it's sea monsters or pirates or something like that. And the thing is, the difficulty curve in that context is dramatic, because it goes from here we are on a boat out in the middle of the water and nothing's happening, this is boring, to okay, the Leviathan just snapped our boat in half, and now we're going to die in a few rounds. Like there's not a lot in between, and it's the same problem with a lot of space games. Like as soon as you're exposed to the vacuum, like you're fucked. So it's really hard to have any of those meaningful degrees of success and failure that we were talking about earlier, when it's such an all or nothing kind of scenario.
Yeah, and specifically in D&D, because it's not like most characters aren't expected to be sailors unless that was made explicitly clear at the beginning of the campaign that, hey, ocean travel or sea travel is going to be a major component of this game. Like where our characters had to cross an archipelago in order to get to where we were going, most of us didn't have any abilities that made it fun, that made it to where we had anything we could contribute other than, yes, I have 2 arms and I can row the ship.
Yeah. It's a little easier to deal with in terms of like ship combat stuff, because then you can figure out roles in the crew. Some people are handling weapons, some people are handling the navigational stuff, some people are doing crafting shit to repair damage, or doing medicine on people who've been wounded. We've seen enough Star Trek and like stuff like that to get an idea of what a diverse group of characters can be doing to contribute to a ship that's in the middle of a crisis combat situation. It's much harder to come up with anything that's interesting at all on a day-to-day basis. And the more I bang my head against sailing and overland travel, the more I'm starting to concede that it probably is just better to tick off a few days rations and roll for a random encounter if something interesting happens or not. But I don't know. Has anybody ever had fun getting lost in the wilderness? That's what I want to know. Is that just a certain type of group that you're asking for, or is that just an objectively boring thing to play?
Theoretically, it doesn't have to be boring, but oh my god, I don't know if I've ever experienced it as a player where it wasn't. Like using the sailing analogy, like in our Abena game, sailing was a big part of that, because even the continents were relatively small and the entire world was an ocean world. Our sea voyages were incredibly boring up until I gave you guys literally an entire floating city that could be maneuvered. then it actually got fun. I could see the players having fun on the quote ship, because it was the Star Trek thing of your ship is so big that you have everything that is interesting going on the ship.
Yeah, and you could do that in some D&D settings that, if they're, late Renaissance kind of settings, and you've got, some huge ship of the line or something, you got some 5 or 6 story or deck, HMS Victory kind of ship. That's the, fantasy game equivalent of the Enterprise or something like that. This vast vessel that has all these different things going on in different discrete locations. But yeah, like you guys in that first edition game, it's a fucking Viking longship. Like, how much interesting stuff is going to go on a longship voyage? Like, not a lot. I did the best I could there, but yeah, it's a tough one.
Unfortunately, that's just one of the realities of sea travel, is that, yeah, you've got these long stretches of just absolute boredom or just punctuated with moments of extreme danger.
Yeah, and we don't need to watch every minute of somebody staring off at the waves, I guess, and that's fine. Let's see. We're getting pretty long here. Is there anything else we should cover? I guess we... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, if you've got something, we can do that first, but I do want to talk a little bit about sports and like those types of mini games, specifically creating those mini games, because I've made several or adapted several sports into games over the years.
Yeah, let's get into that. I guess it's worth mentioning jousting is actually the first mini game. I think you could reasonably say in Dungeons and Dragons, because it shows up in Chainmail, completely separate from all the mechanics to do everything else. It's a self-contained little joust mini game that they run at GaryCon as its own event every year, as I understand it. I unfortunately have never been able to participate in a joust in a D&D game. I would love to, but what kinds of things have you invented for sporting events in games?
Well, about jousting, my character Osbjorn did participate in a joust tournament in D&D 5th edition, and it was not spectacular because it played by pretty much the rules, and the rules are pretty lacking. As far as fun sports that I have played, I have adapted... Well, 2nd edition D&D had an entire subset of rules for not just grappling, but wrestling itself. It proved interesting because there were several different ways that you could win the encounter. And I have, in 3rd edition, I lifted the wrestling rules whole cloth out of the 2nd edition player's handbook and ran that instead of the 3rd edition rules for grappling, specifically for the player characters getting into a wrestling competition. Other sports that I have run, I've done a version of basically an ultra marathon. If you're not familiar with what an ultra marathon is, think of a marathon across the desert and across hundreds of miles. That's an ultra marathon. I've had players do that, and the ultra marathon itself becomes the adventure, and so you're designing the encounters of it along the lines that you would just create an adventure of the player characters going through the wilderness. The last 2 that I've made have been conversions of sports that are described in settings and converted into actual game rules. I don't remember the name of it, but in Eberron, there is this athletic game that is kind of like a mix between like rugby, only over an obstacle course. I've adapted that into the game, and in a Planescape game, I adapted I don't even remember what it was called, but the rules were for this almost basketball style of game, where it was kind of a cross between lacrosse and basketball, where the player characters were given sticks and were told to hit this magically floating ball around this arena. And I turned those into mini games, and I feel like it came out pretty well. For the second one that I mentioned, in the Planescape game with the floating ball that people had to hit toward goals, my players enjoyed it enough that after the tournament was over, they were looking for another tournament to join.
Nice. That's cool. Sounds like you've had more success with it than I have. I've tried gladiator fights. That's worked with some mixed results. I remember in a Star Wars game I ran, I had I can't remember if it was a pod race or a swoop bike race, one or the other, that people were competing in, various little odds and ends like that. But the thing that I found that's difficult about things like that, and this goes with gambling too, and really any of these things that take a long period of time, that might only involve one or a subset of the group. I'm often worried that I'm just giving too much spotlight to whoever's participating in the thing. The best remedy I've been able to work out for that sort of thing is just like letting it be known, like, sorry, y'all, we've got a 4-hour session and there's only so much time. So everybody's going to get, 30 minutes or something to resolve whatever this particular thing is that they're doing, something like that. I don't know. How do you manage, spotlight economy and stuff like that when you've got these like pretty involved kinds of little games for people where you're definitely going to have some portion of the group just sitting by watching?
In those instances, I focus on team games. So like a lot of the gambling stuff just isn't something that I play out in the game. It, like in 5th edition, gambling is reduced down to, I think, like 3 or 4 roles. And I do some narration, but other than that, I don't really go into a very deep devotion of spotlight time for that particular player whenever they're gambling. An exception to that I have run, I don't remember how much the players enjoyed it because it's been so long, but I did have a game where the player characters basically joined in on this, I think it was like a poker tournament. And so in the course of play, we actually sat down and played poker, and the players got to make some rolls on the side to kind of manipulate the cards that they got. And so like if they made a particularly good gambling roll, then they might, like in their 5-hand or in the 5-card stud, they might have an additional 6th card that I laid on the table, and they could choose whether or not they took the card if they got a particular roll on their gambling skill. That I thought that was a lot of fun because, particularly with poker, if you've got a group of people who are trying to take down one mark, then those people can not only work together, but they can cheat together, and that can make the game more fun. Just doing it that way. But in that instance, I was literally just pulling 5-card stud into a D&D game whole cloth.
That's a pretty good idea. I like that. Was that was that your Eberron game? It was like a casino adventure in that.
No. Well, the one I'm thinking about happened like in the early 2000s.
Oh, okay, never mind. Anyway, yeah. I think a lot of these things they're as fun as the DM makes them sometimes, right? Because like a lot of these things are just sort of, when you boil it down, they're little more than prompts for some improvisation and yeah, just kind of something to riff on. If you do just have that straight, simple, role resolution, whatever, it's accounting, it's chores, it's boring. But if you've got an interesting NPC, if you've got interesting circumstances that surround the thing, if you can come up with cool stuff on the fly that spins off of this, I think that's the art that breathes life into the whole thing. It's tremendously difficult to do. Once in a million years, I feel like I kind of get it sort of right. Most of the time, I feel like I get that wrong. But it's one of those things that I think probably spend the rest of your life trying to master.
Yeah. Inventory management is not fun, but it gets very interesting when half of the party slides down into a trap and we realize no one in the party has rope to get them out.
Sure is.
All right. With that said, you ready to move on to geek things?
Let's do it.
All right. I'll go first. I've been watching a lot of YouTube of Charlie Hopkinson. Charlie Hopkinson's YouTube channel. He has been releasing videos for a little more than 6 months now, but he has been releasing deep fakes of basically Star Wars characters, Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker sitting around in an apartment watching Star Wars media, watching Star Wars movies that they are not in, or watching the most recent seasons that are coming out on Disney Plus of various shows. It's a lot of fun. It's fun seeing how far deepfakes have come, and just hearing these people speak, and it sounding just like the characters, and watching it. I really enjoy it. There's Star Wars ones. There's Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf, Elrond, and Boromir are watching the Rings of Power. There's another series of Game of Thrones with Tyrion watching House of the Dragon. I haven't watched any of that yet because I personally haven't watched any of House of the Dragon. But I have watched a lot of the Star Wars and a lot of the Lord of the Rings ones, and they're a lot of fun.
I've got two. The first one is a book that came out a little while ago that covers a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here. It is called On Downtime and Domains, which honestly I just learned. Demesnes is pronounced domains. That's news to me. Anyway, it's this great book that is compatible with all kinds of role-playing games, but it's generally D&D centric. It's not really written for 5e, I don't think, but it could work with a lot of stuff in the D&D realm. Anyway, it's by let me get the author's name here. I could have been prepared a little better, probably. Courtney Campbell. Yeah, Courtney C. Campbell. This thing is jam-packed with stuff. It's 250-something pages, and it is just chock full of the sorts of things we've been talking about. Interesting little mini-games for handling all kinds of stuff related to downtime play. Give it a look. It's probably the densest amount of value for really totally useful, playable kinds of things. If your players say, I want to do X when I have a month off, odds are good that something either spot on or pretty fucking close is covered somewhere in this book. So yeah, On Downtime and Domains by Courtney Campbell. The other thing I wanted to recommend is it's an oldish movie. Fucking 30 plus years old. If you have not seen the 1989 version of Henry V, oh my God, just do yourself a favor and go watch it. I don't know where to find it necessarily. I know where I found it, but it's up to you. But yeah, it's It's directed by Kenneth Branagh. He's the lead. He's playing Henry V. And it is just one of the finest examples of Shakespeare put to film that I've ever seen. And I have to say, over the last several years, just seeing the quality of film just nosedive year after year, just with no end in sight. Just everything I see just seems lower and lower quality. To watch something like this, it's just a breath of fresh air. It's just so well done at every level. So Henry V is great stuff. That's all I got.
Awesome. Well, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Yeah.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.